Today we're taking a look at the largest protest movements the United States has seen in its history. Protests are as American as mullets and apple pie. There isn't a year that goes by without some group jumping up and claiming some sort of injustice is going on and they want it to stop. A majority of the protest movements we've had over the years are legit things and people have an understandable axe to grind. You may not agree with them, but most have at least an understandable position. Occasionally you'll have people taking a stance on things that make you scratch your head. Years back I saw two gentlemen protesting breastfeeding of all things. They wanted it to stop, not just like breastfeeding in public. That wasn't their axe to grind. They wanted it stopped completely, like women had to stop breastfeeding their kids like they've been doing since the dawn of man. They were willing to talk to me, which was their first mistake. They didn't want to talk to me after I said, "What if your mom is Anna Nicole Smith? Are we still a hard no, or is there a little wiggle room?" That question actually made protesters leave the corner they were on and move to another corner. It is very rare that any protest creates immediate change. More often than not, they just bring attention to something which can be seen as a win for a legit reason. Sometimes bringing attention to something backfires. Married with Children, the TV show, was about to be canceled, and then a bunch of moms boycotted Fox and it gained an audience. Everyone wanted to see what the hubbub was. That show lasted 11 seasons. But today's video is just on the biggest protest movements the United States has ever seen. Got it? Get it? Good. Let's take a look. Number 10, the Prohibition Movement. The Prohibition Movement was a campaign in the United States that sought to ban the sale, manufacture, and transportation of alcohol. It began in the late 19th century and gained momentum in the early 20th century, finally ending with the passage of the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution in 1919, which brought on Prohibition. The movement was led by a coalition of different groups: temperance advocates, religious groups, and progressive reformers who believed by getting rid of alcohol would get rid of all of society's woes. You're poor? Quit drinking alcohol. You're out committing crimes? Quit drinking alcohol. Got dandruff? Quit drinking alcohol. Domestic violence? Quit. Well, no, that one's actually pretty legit. Anyway, they argued that banning alcohol would improve health, reduce crime, and promote moral values. The only things it really did was increase crime, corruption, and gave rise to organized crime in the United States. People were making alcohol in their bathtubs and making a fortune selling it. Ultimately, Prohibition was repealed in 1933 due to the widespread public dissatisfaction with its consequences. Number 9, the anti-war movement in the 1960s and 70s. This is also the Vietnam War protests. They were different, but they kind of blended into each other. The anti-war movement in the 1960s and 70s was a significant social and political movement that emerged in response to the United States' involvement in Vietnam. Again, this movement was composed of a diverse range of individuals and groups, including students, peace activists, civil rights organizations, rich and poor people, veterans, hippies. They all came together and demanded an end to the war. This, in my opinion, was one of the most successful protest movements that we've had in the United States. Protests and demonstrations were a key feature to the anti-war movement, with many taking place on college campuses and in major cities across the country. These, of course, if you've ever watched any clips from them, were usually met with violence from the police and the National Guard. At Kent State in 1970, the National Guard started shooting up unarmed students too. So it was a rough time in the United States. Anyone watching this probably has an idea what I'm talking about. It was ugly. The movement was fueled by a growing disillusionment with the government's handling of the war and the impact it was having on both American soldiers and the Vietnamese people. Critics argued the war was costly, unjust, and ultimately unwinnable. The only good thing that came out of the Vietnam War was some incredible music. And the Vietnam and anti-war protests really showed that a protest can actually change things. Number 8, the hashtag Never Again movement for gun control. This one was also known as March for Our Lives movement, also Never Again MSD, which stood for Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. This was an American student-led political action committee for gun control and advocates for tighter regulations to prevent gun violence. It all started after a Valentine's Day incident that happened in 2018. I call it an incident, we all know what it is, but the algorithm picks up on the wrong words and I get demonetized. I'm not taking anything away from their movement. That's not my intent. I just like people to see my videos. But the organization was also known by the Twitter hashtag Never Again and Enough is Enough. This one's still going on and you'll hear things about them spring up every now and then. Most of the kids in it seem to have moved on to college and things like that, you know, the original kids that started this movement, but it still pops up and you'll still see people representing this organization at different, you know, government functions. This one didn't last that long, but it was everywhere. Number 7, Occupy Wall Street. The Occupy Wall Street movement was a social and political movement that began in September of 2011 in New York City's Wall Street financial district. It aimed to draw attention to the economic inequality and corporate greed and the influence that money had on politics. Protesters called themselves the 99%. This is kind of a play off the estimate that 1% of the people have like 75% of the wealth or whatever it is. It changes all the time. I've heard all kinds of different numbers on that, but it is something around 1% of the Earth's population has 75% of the wealth or something around that. Anyway, the 99% camped out at parks and other public spaces to engage in a variety of peaceful demonstrations and acts of civil disobedience. Now, this one got big. The movement quickly gained national and international attention, with similar protests and occupations springing up in cities across the United States and really across the world. The movement really just wanted less money in politics and for billionaires and giant corporations to pay their fair share of taxes. And they wanted more regulations on the financial industry. We were kind of going through that right now. They lifted some regulations and now some banks are failing because they got a little too risky. All these protests and all these movements, they all have some legitimacy and they have some serious gripes. I think Occupy Wall Street had some fine points and requests. The problem is they just always want it to go a little too far. Number 6, the environmental movement, 1960s to present. The environmental movement is a broad social and political movement that aims to protect and preserve the natural environment and its resources. The movement arose in the mid-20th century, around 1960 or so, like I'd said, and it was in response to pollution and the impact of human activities on the planet. Yeah, it didn't start with Al Gore. If you're old enough, I'm sure you remember that Indian crying on the beach. That was easily one of the best advertisements ever. Everyone has that ingrained in their head. If you're too young to know what I'm talking about, imagine this. It was, you know, you're watching Saturday morning cartoons and all of a sudden there's an American Indian paddling up a river and he's wearing the whole, you know, old school Indian outfit, feathers and all. And he comes up onto a beach and it's just littered with soda bottles and paper, cardboard boxes and all that stuff. And the last scene of this commercial is just him crying, like, look what you've done to our land. Very impactful commercial. I don't know if the crying Indian is what got Al Gore on the environmental train, but he's kind of been the leading guy for it for some time now. He did that documentary, The Inconvenient Truth, which I know there's argument, there's a lot of holes in his theories and his facts, but the reality is some of it was true. And if 10% of it was true, it's not good. Anyway, the environmental movement encompasses a wide range of organizations and individuals who work to raise awareness about environmental issues. The environmentalists may focus on issues such as climate change, deforestation, air and water pollution, wildlife conservation, and sustainable agriculture. That's a big one, sustainable agriculture. Number 5, the Black Lives Matter movement, 2013 to present. Now this one's going to get the comment section going, I promise you. This one was huge, it was all over the press, and it's still fresh in our minds. They haven't gone anywhere, they're just not getting as much press as they did after the death of George Floyd. Anyway, the Black Lives Matter movement is a social and political movement that aims to bring attention to and fight against systemic racism and violence against black people in the United States. I guess everywhere. The movement was founded in 2013 by 3 black women, Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullors, and Opal Tometi. I hope I pronounced those names properly. This one was started in response to the acquittal of George Zimmerman. He's the man that shot the teenager Trayvon Martin. Since the founding, the movement has grown and gained international recognition through its use of protests, demonstrations, and social media campaigns to draw attention to police brutality, mass incarceration, and other forms of systemic oppression faced by black people. Number 4, Women's Liberation Movement, 1960s and 70s. The Women's Liberation Movement of the 1970s is also known the second wave of feminism. It was a social and political movement aimed at achieving equal rights and opportunities for women. Back in the 70s, every comedian just called it Women's Lib, and I think pretty much that was the mainstream name for it, Women's Lib. I saw old Johnny Carson things where he's talking to people and asking them, are you one of those women libbers? These days, asking a question like that, he'd be run off the air. Anyway, the Women's Liberation Movement emerged in response to prevailing gender inequalities and discrimination that women faced in various areas of their lives, including education, employment, and politics. The movement focused on a wide range of issues such as reproductive rights, equal pay, sexual harassment, domestic violence, and the representation of women in the media and politics. Activists used a variety of tactics, including protests, rallies, sit-ins. Those were big in the 60s and 70s. They also did these things called consciousness-raising groups. These were done to raise awareness and push for change. These consciousness awareness groups were just like a big Oprah show. They would go places and hopefully the press would show up and women would just discuss their feelings, their needs, and their desires. Could you imagine if men had those? Just be a bunch of dudes sitting around talking about beer and how they like the football season to last a little bit longer. The women's liberation movement did have an impact on society, leading to changes in laws and policies that have helped improve the status of women in many areas. I mean, it's not perfect. There's still things changing all the time. It's like an ongoing struggle. Number 3, the LGBT rights movement, 1960s to present. The LGBT rights movement, also known as the gay rights movement, is a social and political movement that advocates for the rights of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender individuals. It began in the 1960s in response to widespread discrimination and violence against the LGBT community, and has continued to evolve and gain momentum in decades since. There was a documentary years ago, and they were talking about events that happened in the 1980s, and one of the guys they were talking to was a gay gentleman, and he was working in San Diego. When he was on a business trip, his employees, including his manager, thought it would be funny to take his car out and have it painted pink, like bright pink, as a dig to being gay and pink and all that. They thought it was hysterical, and they could not believe that he was upset, and then he eventually quit and sued the company. So in the 1960s, this really all got started with the Stonewall uprising in New York City in 1969. This was a series of protests and riots by the LGBT community against the police because of a raid they did at the Stonewall Inn, which was a popular gay bar in Greenwich Village. The Stonewall uprising is widely considered to be the catalyst for the modern LGBT rights movement. I'd heard about the Stonewall thing, and up until I was researching this, I honestly thought that was the event that happened in San Francisco that Harvey Milk was involved in. You learn something every day. Anyway, since the 1960s, the movement has fought for a wide range of rights and protections, including the right to marry and adopt children, and protection from discrimination in employment and housing. Number 2, the women's suffrage movement. This goes way back, 1848 to 1920. The women's suffrage movement was a political and social movement that fought for women's rights to vote in elections and to have equal political and social rights as men. The movement began in 1848 with the Seneca Falls Convention, where a group of women and men gathered to discuss the rights of women. Over the next several decades, suffragists organized rallies, marches, and lobbied politicians to gain support for their cause. There's a pretty good movie on this. I don't know how accurate it is, but it was a pretty good movie called Iron-Jawed Angels. It was on HBO. It was a pretty good movie. The movement gained momentum in the late 19th century and early 20th century, and the suffragists used a variety of tactics such as hunger strikes and picketing the White House. These ladies played a big part in the 19th Amendment, which among other things gave women the right to vote. All right, before we get to number 1, don't forget we have another channel called On This Day. There is a link for that down below. All right, on to number 1. And number 1, the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement was a social and political movement in the United States during the 1950s and 60s that aimed to end racial segregation and discrimination against African Americans and promote their equal rights and opportunities. It was characterized by nonviolent protests, sit-ins, boycotts, marches, and other forms of civil disobedience, which were met with violent resistance from white Americans and law enforcement agencies. Now, if you don't know anything about this, this is where you'll find people such as Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, Reverend Jesse Jackson was involved, Medgar Evers. The movement was sparked by the landmark 1954 Supreme Court case Brown v. Board of Education, which declared segregation in public schools to be unconstitutional. It gained momentum with the Montgomery bus boycott from 1955 to 1956, in which African Americans refused to ride the city's segregated buses, and continued with the Greensboro sit-ins in 1960, where 4 African American college students sat at a segregated lunch counter and refused to leave. The civil rights movement finally led to significant legal and social changes, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. All right, so there's the United States' biggest protests and movements. There was a few that could have made it on this that were really close. I mean, the Me Too movement, the labor movement, the populist movement, the No Nukes movement, disability rights movement of the 1970s. There was a lot that could have gone on here, but we only do 10 here. All right, that's today's video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Hope you got some information out of it. Now go out, have a great day, and be nice to each other.